Mr. Reed, are you telling this room your dead father signed a document 3 weeks after his funeral? The commissioner asked. Nobody breathed. Graham Voss stared straight ahead, his perfect smile finally gone. Jonah Reed stood alone except for Bishop, the aging German shepherd who had found the hidden floor, the locked box, and the truth buried under Lantern Barn. I'm saying someone used my father's name, Jonah said. And I'm saying they knew exactly what was under that roof. Outside, the old iron lantern swung in the Tennessee wind. 90 days earlier, Jonah had almost sold it all for $6,000. The key looked as if it had been pulled from the heart of an old fire. Not gold, not rust exactly, but a deep copper red, the color of dried clay after rain, resting inside a velvet pouch no bigger than Jonah Reed's palm. It had been buried beneath a roll of frayed measuring tape, 2 dull chisels, and a grease-dark rag at the bottom of his father's toolbox, as though Wade Reed had trusted steel, dust, and silence more than he had ever trusted words. Jonah sat across from the attorney in a narrow Knoxville office that smelled of paper folders, stale coffee, and the kind of air conditioning that made grief feel procedural. Bishop lay beside Jonah's chair, his old German shepherd body stretched along the carpet, one ear lifted, one paw crossed over the other like a retired officer still pretending not to listen. Jonah was 42 years old, broad through the shoulders but worn lean by years of carrying weight no one could see. There was silver at his temples now, though he still kept his hair cut short out of habit, and the scar along his left forearm disappeared beneath the cuff of a faded work shirt he had washed too many times. He had spent 12 years in uniform, most of them building roads, repairing bridges, clearing wreckage after storms, making broken places usable again. People had thanked him for his service more times than they had asked where he slept afterward. These days he lived in a transitional veterans' residence outside Nashville, fixed leaky faucets for cash, and kept his belongings in 2 duffel bags, because part of him still believed any room could be temporary if you did not unpack too much of yourself into it. Mr. Reed, the attorney said, sliding a manila envelope across the desk with careful fingers. This is everything your father left in my possession. Her name was Helen Carver, a woman in her late 50s with patient eyes and a voice trained to soften bad news without changing its shape. Jonah looked first at the envelope, then at the toolbox on the floor. Wade's toolbox. Heavy-gauge metal, blue once, now scratched down to silver along the corners, its latch bent but holding. Jonah had not seen it since he was 20. He remembered it in the bed of his father's truck, under tarps, beside lumber, always leaving before sunrise, always coming back after Jonah had stopped waiting at the window. There's also the property, Helen continued. 26 acres outside Red Willow. A house, though the county report lists it as unsafe for occupancy, and an outbuilding referred to as Lantern Barn. Jonah heard the words the way a man hears rain on a roof he does not own. Distant. Not yet personal. Helen opened another folder. There are back taxes, $3,000. You have 90 days before the county begins seizure proceedings. Jonah almost laughed, but the sound stopped somewhere behind his ribs. He had $160 in his checking account, a truck with a tired transmission, and a dog whose medicine cost more than his own groceries some months. There is, Helen said, gentler now, a standing offer. A developer named Graham Voss has offered $6,000 for the parcel. Given the condition of the property, it may be worth considering. Bishop lifted his head, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough that Jonah noticed. The dog's amber eyes fixed on the toolbox, and something in Jonah tightened. My father knew this man. I don't know, Helen said. But Mr. Voss has inquired more than once. Jonah leaned back. Wade Reed had died 9 months earlier under a bridge restoration crew outside Chattanooga, a fall that had ended in a hospital room before Jonah could drive there. They had not spoken much in the last 5 years. Before that they had spoken in repairs, a replaced alternator, a patched roof, a check mailed without a note. Wade had never been cruel. That was almost worse. Cruelty gave a person something solid to hate. Silence just left a room where questions kept breeding in the walls. Jonah reached down, pulled the toolbox onto his knees, and opened the latch. The smell rose immediately. Old wood dust, machine oil, damp canvas, and beneath it something faintly sweet, like cedar kept in the dark. Bishop stood then, slow because his hips were not what they used to be, and pressed his nose against the metal edge. Jonah moved aside the tools one by one, wrenches arranged by size, a carpenter's pencil worn to a nub, a folded square, a rag wrapped with unusual care. Inside the rag was the velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was the key, cold, dense, waiting. Jonah turned it over in his hand. Its bow was round and plain, except for a small stamped lantern, almost invisible beneath the patina. The teeth were long and complicated, cut for a lock that had been made by someone who expected the door to matter. "Do you recognize it?" Helen asked. Jonah shook his head, but Bishop gave a low breath through his nose and sat back on his haunches as if the room had shifted into a language he understood. Jonah slipped the key into his palm and closed his fist around it. For one brief second, he hated his father for making even death feel like a locked door. Then he hated himself for wanting to open it. "I'll go look at the place," he said. Helen nodded, not surprised. "And the offer?" Jonah looked down at Bishop, at the gray along the shepherd's muzzle, at the old loyalty in his face. $6,000 could solve a few problems. 90 days could create 100 more. But Wade Reed had wrapped that key in velvet and hidden it beneath the only honest tools he owned. That meant either guilt, warning, or love. Jonah had lived long enough to know those three often wore the same coat. "I'll think about it," he said, placing the key in his shirt pocket, close enough to feel its weight against his chest. By dawn, Jonah Reed had learned that a man could drive toward his inheritance and still feel like he was trespassing. Knoxville fell behind him in pale strips of morning light, its office buildings and exit ramps giving way to lower roads, hay fields, gas stations with hand-painted signs, and long fences leaning under the patient weight of time. Bishop rode in the passenger seat of Jonah's old Ford pickup, his muzzle tipped toward the cracked window, breathing in the world as if every mile carried a message Jonah could not yet read. The key lay in the cup holder between them, wrapped again in its velvet pouch, though Jonah kept glancing at it as if it might move. Red Willow was 3 hours southwest, according to the map, but distance had never been the hard part. Jonah had crossed deserts, mountain passes, flooded counties, and broken bridges in his years with the Army Corps, had learned how to measure ground by grade, pressure, load, and risk. But no map had ever taught him how to return to a father who was no longer alive to answer for himself. The September air thickened as the road narrowed, warm and dry, carrying the smell of sunburned grass, cut hay, and red clay dust. It was not the kind of beauty that announced itself. It sat low and quiet in the fields, in the cedar windbreaks, in the tin roofs flashing silver behind stands of oak. Jonah drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near Bishop's shoulder, where the old shepherd's fur had gone coarse with age. "You ever been out this way, boy?" he asked. Bishop blinked once, solemn as a judge, then turned his nose back to the wind. Jonah almost smiled. Almost. Around noon, he pulled into a gas station called Price's Stop and Feed, a squat brick building at the edge of a crossroads where 2-lane blacktop met a gravel road, and a faded church sign promised mercy in letters missing half their paint. The pump handle clicked and groaned in his hand. Bishop stretched stiffly when Jonah opened the door, then stepped down with the careful dignity of an old soldier refusing help. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, motor oil, fried pies, and tobacco that had soaked into the walls decades ago. A woman behind the counter looked up from a receipt book. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair pinned at the back of her head, and forearms browned by a life spent lifting things other people thought were too heavy. "You passing through?" she asked. "Looking for Reedland," Jonah said. "Off County Road 17. Lantern Barn, maybe." The pen stopped in her hand. Not dropped, not shaken, just stopped. Her eyes moved over Jonah's face with the quiet directness of someone comparing a grown man to a memory. Then she looked down at Bishop. "You're Wade's boy." Jonah had not been called anyone's boy in a long time. The words landed awkwardly, almost painfully, like a shirt that had shrunk while stored away. "Jonah," he said. "Jonah Reed. Marlene Price." She came around the counter more slowly than necessary, wiping her hands on a blue apron. "Your father bought nails here, coffee too strong to drink, and sometimes canned peaches for that dog." Jonah glanced at Bishop. The shepherd's ears lifted. "For Bishop, that was his name, wasn't it?" Marlene asked. "Wade asked about him once. Said if that dog still had his nose, you'd never be truly lost." Jonah felt something pass through him, not comfort exactly, but a disturbance, like dust rising in a room he had not opened for years. Wade had known about Bishop. He had remembered. He had spoken of him to a woman in Red Willow while saying almost nothing to Jonah himself. "My father and I weren't close," Jonah said, and hated how thin the sentence sounded. Marlene's expression softened, but not with pity. That mattered. "Your father was a hard man to know from the outside," she said. "Some houses are built with front porches. Wade was more like a storm cellar. Took time to understand why he was there." Jonah looked away toward the window, where Bishop stood near the door, watching the road. "Do you know why a developer wants the property?" Marlene's mouth tightened, just for a second. "Graham Voss wants anything that can be flattened, renamed and sold back to people with better shoes." She slid a paper map across the counter and marked it with a red pencil. "Take 17 until the pavement quits pretending. When you see the black walnut split by lightning, turn left. The driveway hides itself." Jonah paid for gas and coffee. Before he left, Marlene stepped outside and rested one hand briefly on Bishop's head. The dog accepted it without moving away. "He remembers more than you think," she said, though Jonah was not sure whether she meant Bishop Wade or the town itself. The last stretch to Red Willow seemed to slow time. The road buckled in places, patched and repatched, bordered by goldenrod, fence wire, and fields gone rough at the edges. The black walnut appeared just where Marlene said it would, split down the middle, yet still leafed green on one side, dead on the other. Jonah turned left. Gravel snapped beneath the tires. Branches brushed the truck doors. Ahead, the track narrowed until it seemed less like an entrance than a decision. Bishop stood on the seat, front paws braced, his whole body alert now. Jonah felt the key in his pocket grow heavier. Somewhere beyond the trees waited a house he did not want, a barn he did not understand, and a father whose silence had followed him all the way home. The driveway did not welcome Jonah so much as test his nerve. It slipped between the trees in a long red clay scar, washed thin by years of rain and choked at the edges by Johnson grass, blackberry cane, and young sweetgum saplings that had grown bold in the absence of tires. Branches scraped along the sides of the pickup with a dry, whispering sound, and Bishop stood braced on the passenger seat, his nose lifted, his body suddenly younger than his joints allowed. Jonah drove slowly, one hand low on the wheel, feeling every rut through the truck's tired suspension. He had seen abandoned places before. After hurricanes, after floods, after towns lost their factory, and then their grocery store, and then their reasons to keep painting the trim. But this was different. This road had his name at the end of it, and that made every weed feel less like nature and more like accusation. The trees opened without warning. The house stood in the clearing as if it had been waiting too long and had finally begun to fold in on itself. 2 stories once, white clapboard once, proud once, maybe, though pride had leaked out of it a long time ago. The porch sagged along the left side. The front steps had split down the middle, one board lifted like a loosened tooth. A blue tarp, shredded by sun and weather, clung to a corner of the roof where shingles had gone missing. Vines crawled up the chimney. One upstairs window held a jagged triangle of glass that caught the afternoon light and threw it back sharp and useless. Jonah cut the engine. Silence settled around the truck, not empty silence, but layered silence. Cicadas buzzing in the dry heat, a crow calling from somewhere beyond the field, the tick of the cooling engine, Bishop's slow breathing. Jonah sat for a moment without opening the door. He tried to imagine Wade here, tried to imagine his father walking up those steps, carrying lumber, setting down coffee, measuring a window frame with the same battered tape now in Jonah's toolbox. The image would not hold. In Jonah's mind, Wade was always leaving one place or arriving too late at another, never simply standing still. "Well," Jonah said quietly, "this explains the 6,000. Bishop looked at him, unimpressed. Jonah stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the dust. The air smelled of dry leaves, old wood, and the faint mineral scent of a creek somewhere below the slope. He walked toward the house, stopping at the porch when the boards complained under his first cautious step. Not safe. The county had not exaggerated. Through the broken front window he saw a room stripped almost bare, wallpaper peeling in long curls, a fireplace dark with fallen brick, sunlight lying across the floor in narrow bands. It did not feel haunted. That would have been easier. It felt tired, used up, as if everyone had taken what they could carry and left the walls to remember the rest alone. Jonah turned away first. It bothered him that the house did not seem to care. Bishop had already moved toward the back of the property, nose to the ground, tail held level. "Easy," Jonah called, but the shepherd did not stop. He followed a path Jonah had not noticed at first, a narrow track through waist-high grass, past a collapsed chicken coop and a row of fence posts leaning like old men in conversation. The land opened behind the house into a broad, uneven meadow. Goldenrod burned yellow along the edges. A pair of turkey vultures circled far above, patient and black against the pale September sky. Then Jonah saw it, Lantern Barn. It stood beyond the meadow on a slight rise, larger than he expected, built from dark-weathered timber with a rust-red tin roof and stone piers that had settled but not failed. It should have looked abandoned. It did not. The house behind him looked like surrender. The barn looked like endurance. Its wide double doors faced the field. Above them hung an iron lantern, blackened with age, its glass cloudy but intact. Someone had shaped a small roof over it to keep the rain off. A tender, unnecessary gesture that made Jonah's chest tighten in a way he did not understand. Across the header beam, the words were carved deep into the wood, softened by years but still readable. "Every traveler deserves a light." Jonah stood very still. The phrase did not belong on a barn. It belonged over a chapel door, maybe, or a roadside shelter, or in the mouth of a man trying to say something plain and failing beautifully. Bishop approached the doors and sat, not at random. Not because he was tired. He sat directly in front of the lock, his body squared, his ears forward, his amber eyes fixed on Jonah. The lock was old iron, broad as Jonah's palm, red with surface rust but whole. Jonah touched the key through the fabric of his shirt pocket. For a strange second, he did not want to try it. As long as the door stayed closed, the property was still simple. A bad house, a strange barn, a clean offer, a practical exit. Open the door and the place might ask something of him. He had spent years surviving by avoiding places that asked too much. Bishop gave a soft huff, almost impatient. Jonah let out a breath, pulled the velvet pouch from his pocket, and slid the copper-red key into the lock. It fit so perfectly it felt less like discovery than recognition. The mechanism resisted at first, then turned with a deep, dry click that seemed to travel through the boards, through the ground, through Jonah himself. The doors shifted inward on their hinges. A breath of cool air came out, carrying dust, cedar, oil, and something else Jonah could not name yet. Not decay, not emptiness, waiting. The inside of Lantern Barn was cooler than the afternoon outside, not by much, but enough for Jonah to feel the change on his skin. It was the kind of coolness old buildings kept when they had been built with patience. Thick beams, shaded corners, gaps that let the air move without inviting the weather in. Dust lifted around his boots in soft gray breaths. Sunlight entered through narrow seams in the siding and fell across the floor in pale strips, touching workbenches, stacked boards, coffee cans full of nails, and a wall of tools arranged with such care that Jonah felt absurdly, as if he had walked into a room where someone had just stepped out to answer the phone. Nothing about it matched the house. The house had been surrender. This place was discipline. Bishop moved first, slow but certain, his nose passing along the floorboards, the legs of the workbench, a coil of rope hanging from a peg. Jonah stood near the door, letting his eyes adjust. The barn smelled of cedar, machine oil, dry hay, and something faintly medicinal, like old bandages stored in a tin box. On the far wall hung another iron lantern, smaller than the one above the door, and beneath it was a chalkboard clouded with age. Faint words remained under a skin of dust. Coffee, clean towels, ask their name first. Jonah stared at that last sentence longer than he meant to. Ask their name first, not check their papers, not ask what happened, their name. What were you doing out here? Dad, he whispered, and the word Dad sounded strange in the rafters, less like a title than an old coin he had not spent in years. Bishop gave a quiet whine from the workbench. Jonah crossed the room. The shepherd had stopped beside a broad pine table, scarred by saw cuts and burn marks, his nose pressed to the underside. Jonah crouched, running his hand along the apron of the bench until his fingers found a small metal plate hidden beneath a strip of wood. Magnetic, Wade's kind of trick. Jonah pulled it free and found a tiny brass key taped behind it. He almost smiled despite himself. Wade Reed had never labeled anything if he could hide it properly instead. The brass key opened a narrow drawer under the tabletop. It slid out with a tired wooden groan. Inside lay a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed but not yellowed, with Jonah's name written across the front in his father's blocky carpenter handwriting. Jonah did not touch it at first. His mouth had gone dry. He had imagined a lot of things from Wade over the years, excuses, maybe, or instructions, or one of those spare apologies men gave when they wanted forgiveness, but did not want to stand inside the full shape of what they had done. He had not imagined his own name waiting in a drawer beneath a barn workbench. Bishop sat beside him, close enough that Jonah could feel the warmth of the dog's shoulder against his knee. Jonah opened the envelope carefully, hating the care even as he used it. The letter was 3 pages, written in dark blue ink. Jonah, it began, "If you are reading this, I ran out of time before I learned how to say things plain." That was as far as Jonah got before the room seemed to shift slightly, as if the old beams had leaned in. He swallowed and kept reading. Wade did not ask for quick forgiveness. That surprised Jonah. He wrote instead about failure in practical language, the way a builder might describe a cracked foundation. Not to excuse it, but to admit where the weight had been mishandled. He said he had loved Jonah, but had often mistaken providing for parenting. He said work had been easier than conversation because work stayed where he put it, while grief, shame, and fear did not. He said Lantern Barn had belonged first to Jonah's grandfather, Elias Reed, and that Elias had used it for more than storage. Some structures are built from lumber, Wade wrote. Some are built from trust. The first kind will rot if no one repairs it. The second kind will disappear if no one remembers why it mattered. Jonah lowered the page. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the meadow with a dry electric insistence. He felt angry, but the anger had changed texture. It was no longer clean. Clean anger could be carried like a tool. This was heavier, threaded with longing, disappointment, and the unwanted ache of being seen too late. The letter told him not to sell the land until he understood what Lantern Barn had been, and what it could become again. It mentioned no treasure, no grand confession, no easy answer, just a request. Look beneath the floor when Bishop tells you where. Jonah read that line twice, then a third time. Bishop's ears lifted at the sound of his name, as if he had been waiting for his part to arrive. Jonah let the letter rest on the bench and pressed both palms flat against the wood. "You knew about him," he said softly, unsure whether he meant Wade or the dog. Bishop leaned his head against Jonah's thigh, not demanding, not comforting too loudly, just present in the steady way only an old dog can be. For a moment, Jonah wanted to fold the letter, put it back, lock the drawer, and walk out into the hard, bright day where everything could still be simple. But Bishop did not move toward the door. He turned instead toward the deeper end of the barn, where the sunlight thinned and the floorboards waited in shadow. Graham Voss arrived the next morning in a pearl-white SUV that looked too clean for the road it had just traveled. Jonah heard the engine before he saw it, a soft, expensive hum moving up the red clay drive, careful over the ruts, unwilling to be touched by the place. He was standing outside Lantern Barn with a mug of gas station coffee gone cold in his hand, Wade's letter folded in his shirt pocket beside the copper-red key. Bishop lay in the shade near the doors, not asleep, never quite asleep, his amber eyes following the vehicle as it stopped beside the broken house. The man who stepped out was somewhere in his early 50s, trim and sun-browned, dressed in pressed khakis, a pale blue shirt, and boots that had been bought to look rural, without ever having met honest mud. He smiled before he spoke, the kind of smile that opened all at once and closed just as quickly. "Jonah Reed," he called. "Graham Voss. I hope I'm not intruding." Men like that always hoped after they had already done the thing. Jonah set the mug on the workbench just inside the barn. "You drove all the way out here. I believe in meeting people face to face." Voss extended a hand. Jonah shook it because his mother had taught him manners, and the army had taught him not to give away dislike too early. Voss's grip was dry, firm, practiced. His eyes moved over Jonah, then the barn, then the lock on the door, and only afterward the house. Jonah noticed. Bishop noticed too. The shepherd rose slowly and placed himself between Voss and the entrance, not threatening, not dramatic, simply present. A dark sable line, no one had invited the man to cross. Voss gave a small laugh. "Beautiful animal." "He decides who's beautiful," Jonah said. The smile flickered. "Fair enough." Voss turned toward the house, hands on his hips, shaking his head with a sympathy that felt rehearsed. "I'm sorry about your father. Wade and I spoke once or twice over the years. Quiet man, hard worker." Jonah waited. He had learned that silence made certain people uncomfortable enough to tell on themselves. Voss filled it quickly. "This place is a burden, Mr. Reed. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because I've watched too many families lose money trying to save structures that are already past saving. He gestured toward the sagging porch. County violations, roof failure, access issues, insurance complications. Then the tax clock. $3,000 may not sound like much to some people, but 90 days can vanish fast. Jonah felt the words land where they were meant to land. His empty account, his aging truck, Bishop's pills in a brown bottle on the dashboard. The room at the veteran's residence he had not yet admitted he was ashamed to need. Voss stepped closer, lowering his voice as if offering mercy. My offer still stands, $6,000. I can have paperwork ready today, funds transferred by Monday. You walk away clean. Clean. The word rubbed Jonah wrong. Nothing about leaving had ever made him clean. You don't seem very interested in the house, Jonah said. Voss looked at it, then back at Jonah. The house is a teardown and the barn. For the first time, Voss paused half a beat too long. Also complicated. Bishop's tale stilled. Jonah looked at the iron lantern above the door, black against the morning brightness. Complicated enough to buy? Voss chuckled, but the sound had no roots. Land is land, location matters. I have plans that could bring value to Red Willow: jobs, visitors, tax revenue. Your father held on to the past because men his age often do. But sometimes the best way to respect history is to stop dragging it behind you. Jonah felt anger stir, then settle. The old version of him might have answered fast. The older, more tired version knew a polished sentence could still be a shovel. Voss reached into his leather folder and handed Jonah a single-page summary of the offer. Think practically. A man with your background understands triage. You don't save what can't be saved. That one found its mark. Jonah looked toward the barn's shadowed doorway, thinking of Wade's letter, of the chalkboard sentence, ask their name first, and of the line he had read 3 times. Look beneath the floor when Bishop tells you where. He did understand triage. He understood the terrible discipline of choosing where limited strength should go. But he also understood something Voss either did not know or did not value. The person who looked beyond repair was sometimes the one still breathing. I haven't decided, Jonah said. Voss's eyes cooled though his smile stayed. Of course. But don't wait too long. The county won't. He walked back to his SUV, gave Bishop a careful berth, and drove away with red dust rising behind him like a curtain drawn over what he had not said. Jonah stood in the quiet after, holding the offer page. $6,000, a practical exit, a small mercy with teeth. Bishop nudged Jonah's hand, then turned and walked into Lantern Barn without looking back. Jonah followed, not because he had chosen yet, but because for the first time since Helen Carver's office, he understood the offer was not really for the land. It was for his ignorance. That night, Jonah did not sleep inside the house. He did not trust the porch, the roof, or the way the upstairs window watched the field with its one broken eye. So he backed the pickup near Lantern Barn, lowered the tailgate, and made a bed out of an old moving blanket and his rolled jacket. Bishop stretched beside him with a sigh that seemed older than either of them, his head resting close to Jonah's boot, his ears still working the dark. September heat lingered in the boards and metal, but after midnight the air softened. The meadow settled into a chorus of crickets. Somewhere near the creek, frogs called back and forth in patient, watery notes. Overhead, the stars came out clear and indifferent, scattered across the Tennessee sky like nails spilled from Wade Reed's own coffee cans. Jonah lay awake with his father's letter folded against his chest, and Graham Voss's offer folded in his pocket. And between the two papers, his body could not decide whether to feel pulled forward or pushed back. $6,000, $3,000 in taxes, 90 days, 52 years of not understanding Wade Reed. The math did not balance in any clean way. He turned his head and looked at the barn. In the moonlight, the iron lantern above the doors was only a shape, but the carved words beneath it held their place in his mind. Every traveler deserves a light. He wondered how many men had carved noble words over doors and then failed the people at their own tables. He wondered whether doing good for strangers could ever make up for being absent from your son. He did not like that the question had no simple answer. Near 2 a.m, Bishop stood. No bark, no growl. Just a sudden, careful rising as if some quiet instruction had passed through the ground and entered his bones. Jonah opened his eyes. What is it? Bishop stepped down from the tailgate, stiff for the first few paces, then crossed to the barn with a purpose that made Jonah sit up. The shepherd nosed the gap between the doors and gave one short breath. Jonah found the key by touch, slid it into the lock, and opened the barn. The darkness inside felt cool and close. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam moved across the chalkboard, the tools, the stacked boards, and Bishop already halfway down the center aisle, nose low, shoulders intent. Jonah followed, the floor answering under his weight with dry creaks. Bishop stopped near the back left corner, where a work rug lay beneath an old storage shelf. He sniffed along the rug's edge, pawed once, then looked at Jonah. Not excited, not confused. Certain, Jonah pulled the shelf aside and rolled the rug back. The boards beneath were darker than the rest, not by age, but by handling. He crouched and ran his fingers over them. The nails were wrong, too cleanly spaced, too deliberate. Wade's kind of work again, hidden in plain sight. Jonah fetched a pry bar from the wall. The first board resisted, then lifted with a soft complaint. Beneath it was not dirt as he expected, but a shallow wooden cavity lined with oilcloth. His breath slowed. Bishop lowered himself beside the opening, his eyes fixed on Jonah's hands. Inside rested a metal box, black with age but dry, wrapped twice in waxed canvas and tied with cotton cord. Jonah lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than it looked. On top, tucked under the cord, was a folded note in Wade's handwriting, for taxes, repairs, and the next light. Jonah sat back on his heels. The words made no sense and too much sense at once. He untied the cord, unwrapped the canvas, and opened the box. Bundles of cash lay inside, banded and labeled in clean block letters, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. $50,000. Not hidden like greed, not scattered like panic, but stored with intention. Each bundle dated, recorded, waiting for a need Wade had known would come after him. Under the money was a packet of journals, their covers soft from use. Elias Reed 2008, Elias Reed 2011, Wade Reed 2018. There were letters too, dozens of them, some written on hotel stationery, some on lined notebook paper, some in careful hands, some in shaky ones. Jonah lifted the top letter and read only the first line before stopping. Mr. Reed, you were the first person in 6 months who called me by my name before asking what I needed. Jonah felt something in him give way, not break exactly, but loosen, like a door swollen shut, finally moving in its frame. Beneath the letters lay a hand-drawn map of Lantern Barn, showing walls, storage rooms, a rear entrance, and one section marked with a small lantern symbol. Beside it was an old photograph. Wade stood in front of the barn with a group of adults of different ages and backgrounds. A man in a postal jacket, a woman in a diner apron, 2 veterans in faded caps, a nurse with tired eyes, a farm worker holding his hat against his chest. No one looked rescued. That was what struck Jonah. They looked seen. Bishop leaned forward and touched the edge of the photograph with his nose. Jonah let out a breath that shook more than he wanted it to. You found it, he whispered. Bishop looked up at him, calm and grave, as if finding things was never the miracle. The miracle was whether people were brave enough to understand what they had found. By morning, Jonah had read enough of the journals to understand that Lantern Barn had never really been a barn. Not in the way the county records meant it. It had held hay once, probably, and feed and mower blades, and all the ordinary equipment of rural work. But somewhere along the line, Elias Reed had taken a structure built for storage and taught it how to shelter. Jonah sat at the workbench with Bishop asleep beneath it, one old paw resting on Jonah's boot, while sunlight pushed through the siding in thin golden lines. The cash remained in the metal box, untouched except for the counting Jonah had done twice, because disbelief made a man repeat simple things. $50,000. Enough to pay the taxes, enough to repair the roof, enough to prove Wade had planned for this moment with a care he had rarely shown out loud. The first journal began in 2008, written by Elias in a steady hand. The economy had folded in on itself that year, and Red Willow, like many towns, had learned how quickly a man could go from working overtime to standing in a parking lot with his last paycheck and no idea where to set his pride down. Elias did not write like a preacher. He wrote like a builder, taking measurements, names, dates, meals served, beds cleaned, calls made, rides arranged. But between those plain entries, something warmer moved. A machinist from Ohio stayed 3 nights, found work in a cabinet shop. A retired nurse passing through rested here after her car gave out, helped restock the first aid shelf before she left. 2 veterans drove in from Arkansas after a job lead disappeared. and slept 14 hours straight before either of them could speak without staring at the floor. Jonah turned pages slowly. No one was described as broken. No one was reduced to a cautionary tale. Elias called them guests. Always guests. On the inside cover, written in darker ink, were the rules of the place. Do not ask why someone fell before offering them a chair. Do not make a hungry person prove hunger. Do not turn pain into gossip. If a man gives you his name, use it like it matters. Jonah read that last line more than once. He thought about the ways people had named him after he came home. Veteran, patient, applicant, case number, service-connected, unemployed, stable enough, not yet stable enough. Words meant to organize him had sometimes made him feel less human than the silence they replaced. He rested his thumb against the page. Bishop opened one eye, watching him with the weary patience of a dog who had waded through more human sorrow than anyone had thanked him for. The hand-drawn map led Jonah to the rear wall behind a bank of tool cabinets. Bishop reached it first, of course, nosing along a seam Jonah might have missed. The wall looked solid until he moved a hanging rack of clamps and found a recessed latch shaped like half a lantern flame. He pulled. A section of shelving swung inward with a sigh of old hinges. Behind it was a narrow room, windowless but clean, with 2 cots folded against the wall, a shelf of blankets sealed in plastic bins, a metal cabinet marked first aid, a coffee percolator, towels, soap, work gloves, and a corkboard covered in yellowed index cards. Jonah stepped inside as if entering a chapel no one had named. There was nothing dramatic in the room, no treasure beyond order, no secret beyond mercy made practical. A list of phone numbers for clinics, repair shops, legal aid, job placement offices. Bus schedules, a map of county shelters, a handwritten sign above the small sink, let them wash before they explain. Jonah had to sit down on one of the folded cots. He understood construction. He understood load-bearing walls, drainage, stress points, the difference between damage and collapse. Looking around that hidden room, he understood that Elias and Wade had built a place around a truth most people praised in public and avoided in private. Dignity had logistics. Respect required towels, coffee, clean socks, a working lock, a name spoken without suspicion. He found Wade's journal last. The entries began in 2018, after Elias's handwriting had stopped. Wade's was rougher, heavier, often crowded at the margins. He wrote of keeping Lantern Barn open quietly, of paying taxes late, of patching the roof alone, of visitors who stayed one night, and others who returned years later just to leave a note. He also wrote about Jonah, not often, never enough, but enough to hurt. Saw Jay on Veterans Housing List, did not call. Cowardice wears many coats. Later, asked about Bishop. Good dog, better friend to my son than I knew how to be. Jonah closed his eyes. The anger was still there, but it no longer stood alone. It had company now. Grief, yes, and confusion, and a reluctant tenderness he did not know where to put. He had wanted Wade to be simple. A failed father, an absent man, a closed case. But the barn refused to let anyone be only one thing. Outside, the wind moved through the meadow, and the iron lantern above the door gave a faint creak on its bracket. Bishop came into the hidden room and rested his gray muzzle on Jonah's knee. Jonah placed one hand on the dog's head and looked at the shelves, the beds, the names pinned to the corkboard. I didn't know him at all, did I? He said. Bishop did not answer. He only stayed, which in that room felt like answer enough. Price did not seem surprised when Jonah returned to the gas station with dust on his boots, Bishop in the truck bed, and the look of a man who had opened the wrong door and found his own life waiting behind it. She was outside stacking bags of feed beneath the awning, the late morning sun bright on the silver in her hair. Traffic moved past in lazy intervals, a pickup, a mail jeep, a sedan with one missing hubcap, each vehicle raising a small red cloud that drifted over the road and vanished. Jonah parked near the ice machine. Bishop stepped down slowly, shook himself once, then walked to Marlene as if they had known each other longer than either of them had lived. She looked at the dog, then at Jonah. You found something. It was not a question. Jonah held up one of Elias Reed's journals. I found names. Marlene's face changed in a way so slight most people would have missed it. But Jonah was learning to notice the small hinges grief turned on. Her mouth softened first, then her eyes moved away toward the fields beyond the road. Then I suppose it's time some of us stopped pretending we forgot. Inside, she locked the front door and turned the little sign to back in 15. Though Jonah had the feeling Red Willow measured 15 minutes generously. They sat at a corner table near the coffee urn. Bishop lowered himself beside Jonah's chair with a tired grunt. Marlene poured coffee for both of them, but did not drink hers. She touched the cover of the journal with 2 fingers. "I stayed there in 2011, she said. "After the flood took my place out by Briar Creek, insurance called it an act of God. Bank called it insufficient coverage. Folks called it a shame, which is what people say when they want to sound kind without getting involved." Jonah said nothing. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt respectful. "Your father gave me a bed, a towel, coffee, and the phone number of a woman who needed help running this store. He never asked me how I let things get so bad. He never once made me perform my misery for him." Her eyes returned to Jonah. "That matters more than people think." Jonah thought of the handwritten sign in the hidden room, "Let them wash before they explain." He felt the sentence settle deeper. Why was it hidden? Marlene leaned back, tired now. "Because kindness attracts 2 kinds of people, the ones who need it and the ones who want to control it." She wrote an address on a receipt and slid it across the table. "Arthur Bell kept records for Elias, retired postal man. He remembers what paper forgets." Arthur Bell lived at the end of Sycamore Lane in a small brick house with tomato cages in the yard and wind chimes made from old keys. He was 73, thin, brown-skinned from sun and age, with careful hands and a hearing aid he adjusted before inviting Jonah in. Bishop inspected the porch, approved it, and settled near the door. Arthur listened without interrupting while Jonah explained the journals, the hidden room, the money, the offer from Graham Voss. At Voss's name, Arthur gave a dry laugh. "That man has been trying to put a pretty sign on other people's history for 20 years. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a flat metal drawing tube, a folder of photocopied deeds, and a ledger wrapped in a rubber band. Wade asked me to hold copies. Said if anything happened, papers should have more than one home." The tube held original drawings of Lantern Barn, not as a storage building, but as a community rest structure with rear access, washroom plumbing, cot storage, and storm shelter reinforcement. The ledger listed repairs, donations, visitors by first name only, and county correspondence. Then Arthur showed Jonah the document that made the room go still. An access easement bearing Wade Reed's signature, granting Graham Voss development rights along the back road. The date was 3 weeks after Wade's funeral. Jonah stared at it until the letters blurred. No shouting came, no dramatic anger, just a cold, precise sorrow. Even in death, his father's name had been treated as a tool someone else could pick up and use. Bishop rose and crossed the room, placing his muzzle against Jonah's hand. Arthur watched the gesture with quiet understanding. "Your father was not a perfect man," he said. "None of us who knew him would sell you that lie. But he did not sign that paper, and he did not build Lantern Barn so a man like Voss could turn mercy into a marketing feature." Jonah folded the copy carefully. Outside, the wind moved through Arthur's key chimes, and for a moment the sound was almost like locks opening. The county hearing room in Red Willow had once been a school library, and something of that older purpose still clung to it. The high windows, the worn oak floor, the faint smell of dust, paper, and floor wax, the kind of quiet that made people lower their voices without being told. Jonah arrived 20 minutes early with Bishop at his left side, a cardboard banker's box under one arm, and the copper-red key in his shirt pocket. He had worn the best thing he owned, a navy button-down with a frayed collar and boots he had polished until the cracks looked almost intentional. He felt underdressed the moment Graham Voss walked in. Voss wore a charcoal suit, silver watch, and the calm of a man accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. 2 attorneys followed with leather folders and laptops. Jonah had Arthur Bell, Marlene Price, a box of old paper, and a German shepherd whose back legs trembled slightly when he stood too long. Still, when Bishop lowered himself beside Jonah's chair, the room seemed less lonely. The 3 county commissioners sat behind a long table. At the center was Commissioner Elaine Whitaker, a woman with white hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She called the matter by its formal name: Delinquent Tax Review, Land Use Petition, and Contested Development Access. Formal words had a way of making human things sound safely distant. Jonah opened his box. Voss's attorney spoke first. He was polite, almost warm. He explained that the Reed property was unsafe, neglected, and economically stagnant. He said his client wished to bring revenue, visitors, and jobs to Red Willow. He said Lantern Barn, while picturesque, did not meet modern standards and had no recognized designation. He said Mr. Reed, though surely sincere, lacked the resources to maintain the property responsibly. Jonah felt every sentence try to shrink him, not insult him, shrink him, reduce him to a man with insufficient funds and sentimental attachment. When it was his turn, he stood slowly, one hand brushing Bishop's head before he stepped forward. He did not begin with accusation. Something in him, perhaps Wade's letter, perhaps the barn itself, told him dignity should not have to shout to be heard. "My father left me a place I thought was worthless," Jonah said. "I came here to decide whether to sell it. I almost did." The room stilled at the honesty of that. He placed Wade's letter on the table, then Elias's journals, then the original plans from Arthur's metal tube. He showed the commissioners the carved phrase above the barn door, the map of the hidden room, the list of supplies, the rules written in Elias Reed's hand. Do not make a hungry person prove hunger. If a man gives you his name, use it like it matters. Elaine Whitaker leaned forward as Jonah read that line aloud. He heard Marlene take a quiet breath behind him. Then Jonah presented the metal box record showing $50,000 set aside for taxes and repairs. "The back taxes can be paid today," he said. "The first repairs can begin this month." Voss's smile thinned. His attorney objected to the relevance of personal letters. Arthur Bell stood then, careful but steady, and identified the plans, the ledger, the copies Wade had asked him to keep. Marlene spoke next. She did not dramatize her story. She simply said that when she had lost her home in the flood of 2011, Wade Reed had given her a bed, a towel, coffee, and her own name back. "I was not a project to him," she said. "I was a person having the worst year of my life." Finally, Jonah laid the easement paper on the table. "This document gives Mr. Voss access rights," he said. "It carries my father's signature. It is dated 3 weeks after my father died." No one spoke for several seconds. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush. Voss did not look at Jonah. He looked at his attorneys, and that told the room more than any confession would have. Commissioner Whitaker requested the document be entered for review and suspended all development access claims pending investigation. The tax seizure proceedings were paused. Once Jonah submitted payment from Wade's recorded restoration fund, Lantern Barn would be evaluated for local historic and community use protection. It was not a sweeping victory with applause and music. Real life rarely knew when to cue either. It was papers gathered, dates stamped, voices lowered, a gavel tapped once against wood. But Jonah felt the ground under him change. Outside on the courthouse steps, Bishop leaned against his leg, tired but upright. Jonah looked toward the road leading back to the Reed land. For the first time, he did not think of it as a burden waiting to be escaped. He thought of it as a door left open. The first thing Jonah repaired was not the roof, it was the sign. The practical part of him knew the roof mattered more. The gutters sagged, the rear wall needed bracing, the old washroom plumbing had to be inspected before anyone could use it, and the county wanted forms in triplicate before a single volunteer could carry in a paintbrush. But on the morning after the hearing, Jonah stood on a ladder beneath the front beam of Lantern Barn, with a wire brush in one hand, Bishop watching from the shade below, and cleaned the carved words until the old sentence could breathe again. "Every traveler deserves a light." Dust fell across Jonah's sleeves. Sun warmed the back of his neck. Out in the meadow, late September grass moved in slow waves, gold and green under a sky so clear it seemed to forgive nothing and promise everything anyway. He worked carefully, following each letter with the brush, then with a cloth, then with his thumb. Wade's letter was folded in the pocket of his work pants now, softened at the creases from being read too often. Jonah still did not know what to do with all of it. The apology that came too late, the money that came exactly on time, the tenderness hidden so deep it had almost become indistinguishable from absence. Some days forgiveness felt too large a word. But repair did not require him to feel noble. It only required him to show up, measure what was damaged, and begin. Marlene came by with coffee and a list of people willing to help. Arthur brought the ledger, 3 folding chairs, and a box of keys he claimed might be useful someday. A roofer named Darnell offered a weekend rate, so low Jonah knew better than to call it business. 2 veterans from the next county drove in with tool belts and quiet manners. A retired nurse stocked the first aid cabinet. No one made speeches. No one asked Jonah to tell the story in a way that made them feel generous. They just worked. Boards were replaced, hinges oiled, cots unfolded and checked, towels washed. The hidden room was cleaned but not polished into something false. Jonah left the old signs in place, including the one above the sink. Let them wash before they explain. He added only one new rule beneath it, written in his own block letters, trying not to notice how much they resembled Wade's. No one here is a burden. By the third week, the iron lantern above the barn door had been rewired. It still held its old shape, blackened and imperfect, but new glass caught the afternoon light. The county had not yet finalized the historic designation, and Voss's lawyers had grown quieter but not vanished. The house remained unlivable, its porch still bowed, its windows still blind. Jonah slept in the pickup some nights, and in a rented room in town on others. Nothing was finished. That was the honest beauty of it. For most of his life, Jonah had believed a man needed to be whole before he could be useful. Lantern Barn taught him otherwise. A cracked beam could hold if properly braced. A tired dog could still find what mattered. A son could carry anger and love in the same chest and not be false to either. The first guest arrived on a Thursday evening, though Jonah would later think of him less as the first than as the first after the light came back. His name was Raymond Ellis, 61, a former mill worker whose truck had broken down outside Red Willow on his way to a job interview in Alabama. He stood at the threshold with a paper bag of clothes, dust on his shoes, and the careful embarrassment of a man trying not to need too much. Jonah saw it immediately because he knew the posture. Bishop saw it too and rose from his place under the lantern, moving forward with slow, grave courtesy. Raymond looked down at the German shepherd. "He friendly, he's particular," Jonah said. Bishop sniffed Raymond's hand, then stepped aside, granting passage as if the barn were his to approve. Raymond gave a small, surprised laugh, and something in his shoulders lowered. Jonah did not ask how he had fallen short. He did not ask for proof of hardship. He opened the door wider. "Come on in, Mr. Ellis. Coffee's fresh. Towels are on the shelf. We'll figure the truck out after you sit down." Raymond blinked at the sound of his name, and Jonah understood then why Elias had written the rule so plainly. A name could be a handrail. A name could keep a man from disappearing while he climbed back toward himself. That evening, as cicadas started up beyond the meadow, and the first purple of dusk gathered in the trees, Jonah stepped outside with Bishop beside him. Arthur and Marlene were still inside talking softly with Raymond over coffee. The barn smelled of cedar, clean cotton, and something warm on the stove. Jonah reached into his pocket and took out the copper-red key. He hung it on a hook just inside the door beneath a small plaque he had carved from scrap walnut. "This key does not open a building. It opens a promise." Then he flipped the switch. Above the doors of Lantern Barn, the old iron lantern glowed for the first time in years. A steady amber light spilling over the red dirt, the tall grass, the weathered house, and the two figures standing below it. A veteran who had finally stopped running from home, and a German shepherd who had known the way all along. "Before you go, tell me which moment stayed with you most. The key, Bishop, or the lantern lighting up again. And where you're watching from. And if this story reminded you that every person deserves to be seen by name, consider liking and subscribing for more stories like this."